opportunity to have a chat with Glenn or with Ruth or with any of the other speakers who haven't done so far, we're back at 1:45. We return for two more interesting papers. And the first one is by someone called Paul Goodliff, who's going to offer a paper on the baptism of Jesus.
Thank you. What I want to look at with you is some theological reflections, particularly around ecumenism, from a painting by Piero della Francesca. And if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Here it is. It hangs in the National Gallery, so if you've got half an hour before going home, you can actually pop down the road and go and see it. I first used this painting in a book called Shape for Service and did some aspect of theological reflection upon it. And I'm now in the beginnings of writing a book which I hope will be the beginning of a whole new genre for those people who, having finished their Lent book on Epiphany and can't wait till Lent to begin to start their Lent book, will have something called an Epiphany book to read in between. And I'm hoping that it will get published in that kind of an idea. It probably won't start a vast rush of Epiphany books, but let's wait and see. It ought to be commissioned by someone, and I think it ought to be commissioned by the General Secretary of Churches Together in England, which was the post I've just retired from. That sounds rather good, doesn't it? The General Secretary of Churches Together in England's Epiphany book. Well, we'll wait and see. Anyway, this book is in the beginnings of being written. There'll be about half a dozen, maybe 15 shortish chapters. It's not intended for an academic market, which most of my other books have been, and so it will be rather different. I'm enjoying writing it thus far. It's been converted into home group materials, which I'm testing out in the home group that my wife and I run, and we'll see how that goes. So this painting has considerable debate about something of its history, and a little bit of art history to begin matters is no bad thing. By the way, I think I'm on in the middle of the afternoon because there are pictures, because that probably helps you not to fall asleep. So if you read some of the older books on Piero della Francesca, the idea is that this is probably painted in 40s, early 50s, all the early 1440s, as Piero went to Florence. Some older, even older books refer to this as being written in the 1450s. Those ideas were based on the idea that Piero couldn't possibly have painted this painting in 1438 to 1439, when it probably was painted, because he would have been far too young. But we have no record of his birth. We have no birth certificates or records. We are probably indebted to Vassario for getting the date of his birth right, probably about 1402 or 1403. He was largely neglected until the late 19th century, when he was kind of rediscovered, and the National Gallery bought this picture in 1861 when it came up for sale. An interest in Piero della Francesca began to grow. He's now recognized as one of the 2 or 3 early masters of the early Italian Renaissance. If we go for the date of the early to mid 1430s as the genesis of the work, and then a commission, and then its painting, then it's probably destined for one of the churches in Piero della Francesca's hometown. So he grew up in a family of leather makers, which is kind of a middle ranking kind of profession. He wasn't one of the nobility or the elite. He wasn't one of the lower classes in that medieval Italian town. His father was a leather worker and had aspirations, we think, for Piero to make something better of himself than a leather worker. But he decided to stay in what is essentially at this stage a craft, the craft of painting, whereas we think his father, who first apprenticed him to a merchant, rather like to think he would raise the family's status. He never did, because painting in the 15th century in Italy was still essentially viewed as a rather menial task. They didn't hold artists in the esteem with which we do now. That came really with a generation later than Piero. So if we go with that date, it's painted for an altar in the church of Santa Giovanni Battista, St. John the Baptist, in San Sepolcro. It was probably therefore commissioned by one of the nobles of the surrounding area who had become the parish priest and part of that noble family, and he commissions this for his church. The money had been granted much earlier, but no one had ever worked out how to spend it or who to spend it on until this young protege of San Sepolcro, who had been apprenticed for probably at least 15 years when he comes to paint this painting, was chosen. It's a fascinating painting. It's one that I endlessly can look at, and part of what the book will be an extended paying of attention to something. And that's a metaphor for me for what the Christian life is. It's a lifelong paying attention to God. So the painting's in front of you. You can see it, although not very clearly, I guess. It needs a much bigger screen in many ways, but it's quite simple in its structure. So we've got Christ in the center, standing not quite full square. He's bearing the weight on one side of his hips rather than on the other. Hands are held together in prayer, and John the Baptizer is pouring water on his head. You have to realize that in the late medieval period, John the Baptist was not a Baptist. Although I think John the Baptist probably was a Baptist, and Jesus in the biblical records came up out of the water. In other words, he did get wet all over. He doesn't quite in this picture. Just to the right of John the Baptizer is another person about to get baptized, and he's taking his tunic off, but keeping his wife fronts on to protect his dignity at this point. And on the left of Jesus, almost as another character in the painting, is a tree. You can see the pale color of its trunk and then the dark leaves. We'll come back to that tree in a little while. And then on the far left-hand side of the painting are three figures. They are angels. We know that because the one on the farthest left, facing slightly away from us, you can see his rainbow-colored wings. You need to remember that in this period, whether it's a painting by Piero della Francesca or his near contemporary Fra Angelica, angels always have wonderfully rainbow-colored wings. None of this white fairy stuff. It's just full of color. In fact, the three angels are there. Well, why are they there? It's a rather curious addition. They could be a number of things, and that depends on why we think this is an Epiphany painting. So Epiphany happens on the 6th of January, the Feast of the Epiphany. It lasts until Candlemas, when the season of Epiphany ends, and we have a period of ordinary time, more or less, because Lent is a more or less movable feast, until Lent begins. And on this feast of the Epiphany, three stories are told from the scriptures. The first is the baptism of Jesus, and that's told again 2 days later on January the 8th, which is the feast of the baptism of Jesus. Secondly, the visit of the Magi to the infant Christ is told. And thirdly, the first sign in John's Gospel of Jesus' identity and power, the turning of water into wine. So remember those three biblical stories. They would have been in the iconography of Epiphany, and depending on how you read this painting, all three stories are told. So those three figures, which we know are angels, could also stand as the bridegroom's friends, the friends of the bridegroom who support the bridegroom in a Jewish wedding. They could also be part of the angel choir around the nativity story, but probably they're there to represent the Trinity. And they wear the colors that a pope in the previous century had designated for the three figures of the Trinity, red, white, and blue. And so the different colors of the clothes that those three angels wear is representative of the three persons of the Trinity. And of course, echo the three angels who turned up at Abraham's door when he was camping under the oak tree at Mamre to say, you're going to have a child by Sarah, and Sarah laughs at the prospect because she's well beyond the menopause. Those three angels, or three men, as they're described, first of all, angels later in the chapter, and Abraham, in his recollection of what's happened, says, I have met the Lord. So the conflation of those three things come together, and in this iconography, these three angels stand for the Holy Trinity. Of course, it's most clearly and famously seen in Rublev's icon of the Holy Trinity, where you have the three angels sitting around a table. So the angels are there. One of them is clasping the hands, the right hand two, not the one in red and blue, but the right hand two are clasping hands, and clasping, joining hands, of course, is a sign of covenant. It's what you do if you get married. It's one of the things you have to do if you get married. If you don't join hands, technically you're not married. And so it's a sign of the beginning of a covenant. And there's something, therefore, about covenant going on in this picture. If you look above the head of Jesus, you can see a white dove, and that's the Holy Spirit coming upon Jesus as he's baptized. And you won't see it from this picture, but go down to the National Gallery, get up close and personal and look very clearly, and you'll see that from the top of the painting right down to Jesus' shoulders is a shower of very faint flecks of gold paint. And this is reflective of the glory of God coming upon Jesus. It's also reflective of the words. The thing about a painting is you can't hear anything. So how do you do it? Well, if you want to be very blunt, as Fra Angelica was in one of his paintings of the Annunciation, the one that now hangs in Cortona, where it actually was painted for, he paints the words in between the angel and Mary. So you can read it, and the right way up is some words in Latin of the angel speaking to Mary, and then upside down is Mary's words back to the angel saying, yes, I am God's servant, let it be to me. And so you can paint it in. But Piero della Francesca hasn't been quite so blunt about that, and he's illustrated the words of God, God speaking his word to the baptized Jesus, you are my son, with you I take great delight, in this shower of gold flecks of paint. Piero is bringing all of these aspects of the story of the baptism of Jesus together for a church dedicated to John the Baptist, and therefore it's a very appropriate painting. We think it hung in that church for a couple of 100 years, accompanied by two panels on either side, which the National Gallery couldn't buy. They are still in the museum in San Sepolcro. San Sepolcro, by the way, is a little town sort of halfway across Italy between Florence and the Adriatic coast. Its founding myth, and therefore its name, was that a couple of pilgrims coming back from the Holy Land carrying a great big chunk of rock, which they believed was a relic from the Holy Sepulchre, were told in a dream to stop in this valley, which was a wood at the time, and build a shrine for the rock, the lump of masonry, which was from the Holy Sepulchre. They duly were obedient and did so, soon got replaced by a bigger chapel and then by an abbey. And the abbey became an influential Camaldolite abbey in the area. And so the people of San Sepolcro thought of themselves as a rather holy people because they had in the heart of their founding story part of the Holy Sepulchre, hence the name San Sepolcro, Holy Sepulchre. And they thought of themselves as something of a New Jerusalem, because part of the old Jerusalem had been brought there into the middle of Italy, and here they were building this New Jerusalem community in the middle of Italy in the medieval period. Actually, it was founded in about the 8th or 9th century, and the story of the two pilgrims is probably just that, a myth. Nonetheless, it's a nice way of understanding your origins. Jesus is standing in what is effectively the River Jordan, although actually it's the River Tiber, which flows through San Sepolcro or by San Sepolcro on its way to Rome. And if you look very carefully, there's water behind Jesus, but in front of Jesus, it's just very muddy. Where did the water go? Well, another one of the myths and stories and traditions of Jesus's baptism that was widespread in the late medieval period was that when Jesus was baptized, the Jordan backed up, just as it had done when God's people entered across the Jordan into the promised land under Joshua. And so Jesus, didn't have to get wet all over, which rather accords with Catholic baptismal practice, doesn't it? But I rather want to reject that part of the story. I don't think that happened. But nonetheless, it's portrayed here in the painting as a reflection of the story. So there's all sorts of themes that you can get out of this picture. You can talk about angels. You can talk about the Trinity. You can talk about baptism. You can talk about Jesus. You can talk about John the Baptist, the wedding at Cana, etc., etc. You can even talk about the cross, because actually that tree is identifiably a walnut tree. The whole area was called the Valle di Nocera, the Valley of the Walnuts, because the walnut just grows everywhere in this valley. And the trees that Piero has painted very accurately are walnut trees. And again, in late medieval iconography and belief, the cross was made from walnut. And the walnut itself, if you know a walnut, you get them at Christmas, don't you? You have to crack the hard outer shell, and inside is the soft nut that you eat. And it was symbolic of the hardwood of the cross and the soft flesh of the Savior being there together. And so almost like another figure in the painting, certainly overlooming everything, is the shadow of the cross. And if we could have the next slide, the angels look rather apprehensive as what is going on. I mean, are they joining in with John the Baptist's own question? Why am I baptizing you? You should be baptizing me, is what he says to Jesus. Or is it that they have an awareness of what this baptism will lead to? And certainly, next slide, please. If you look at, next slide beyond. We may come back to that one beyond that. If you look at Jesus's face, he's certainly not looking at us. His eyes are downcast, he's withdrawn, It's clearly not a very joyful experience that Jesus is undergoing. And it's not just because his feet were getting muddy. He is perhaps beginning to be aware, or a deepening of that awareness of what this baptism will lead to 3 years later. And so the shadow of the cross overlooks that. But if we could go back 3 slides, is that possible? Thank you. Back to the main one. There we are. It's not very easy to see in this picture, but there are some other figures in the painting, and they're just behind the person who's about to get baptized, alongside and just behind John the Baptist. And there are 4 of them. And they could be the elders coming up from Jerusalem to see what John the Baptist is doing. That's probably, yes, thank you. A little marker is showing where they are. Or they could be the Magi, and the tradition that there are only 3 of them is not yet deeply embedded in the thought. So, you know, all we know from the biblical record is there are Magi, and there could have been half a dozen of them, not necessarily just the 3. But the dress they're wearing is very interesting, because it's certainly not Florentine or Tuscan dress, and it's certainly not ancient Israelite dress, or the dress of people in Jesus's own day. I mean, and none of them are wearing dress. It's a very contemporary painting in that way. They're wearing the dress of Byzantine court officials. Why has Piero della Francesca painted the Magi as Byzantine court officials? Well, it's probably because the Camaldolite Abbey at the center of San Sepolcro was had as his abbot general of the order someone who was deeply involved in the Council of Florence. And the Council of Florence was when the Byzantine delegation came to Ferrara, moved on to Florence because the plague also came to Ferrara, and they were coming to appeal to the Western Empire, the Romans and the Roman Church, for military assistance, as Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, was being threatened by invasion from the Turks, from the Muslims. And the Roman Church pressed quite a hard bargain for an agreement to reunite after 400 or so years of schism, after the Filioque controversy in 1054, when the Eastern and Western Church split. And while they got an agreement, and for a few months, since 1054, the whole of the church from Syria right the way west to as far as it went was again one church. When that deal, or that council decision, got taken back to Babylon, not to Babylon, to Byzantium, to Constantinople, the anti-Roman party was in the ascendancy, and it basically didn't get ratified. And so Piero would have probably seen people in Florence on his occasional visits to that city. It's not very far away from San Sepolcro. Would have seen these officials out and about in the streets as they were there with their emperor and all sorts of court officials. And so he's painted them because of this famous Camaldolite abbot general who was central to the whole movement. He was an early ecumenist. And that's one of the reasons why I've been fascinated by this painting in the last little while, because it is an ecumenical painting. It reminds us as Baptists that we haven't been very good at ratifying what has come before us. The discussions between the Church of England and the Baptist Union, of which I was a part, came to council where it was received but not welcomed, rather irritatingly. And we had all sorts of conversations in the early noughties with the Independent Methodists to become one church with them. And while the Baptist Union ratified that, the Independent Methodists didn't. And this is a story in many ways illustrated in this whole painting, that ecumenism is one thing, but getting it lived out in the life of the church is another. And it's my prayer that this might be a metaphor for how we need to work hard to make our ecumenical endeavors more widely adopted. Anyway, anything more on the book, you'll have to wait a couple of years and buy it.
I could tell you could keep talking for a very, very long time, but we want to see if there's any questions, just as this painting has been opened up to us in the few minutes that we have. Ivan.
Ivan King from Southend. That's a very compelling painting. The management guru, Charles Handy, records that he used to dedicate one visit a year to San Sepolcro to go and look at the sister paintings by della Francesca and gaze upon them as the most compelling paintings in the world. When I've used images in a church context, I've always felt that there's some kind of residual suspicion of images in church. Do you think that's something that we Baptists still carry around with us? The risk of idolatry from images?
Yes, that kind of suspicion of iconography is part of, it's not just Baptist, I think it's part of the Protestant reaction to the imagery of the Catholic Church. I think much to our detriment. Pictures have a way of getting underneath the skin of our hyper-intellectualizing of our faith, and they can help us pay attention in ways that lots of words can't. So I think it's regrettable. When I was at Stevenage in Bunyan Baptist, there was the minister, I had a picture, a large poster of Rembrandt's painting of the prodigal son, and I put it right at the front of the church. When I went back about a year later, having moved on, I discovered they'd relegated it to the vestry. So it's symptomatic that these things can be quite short-lived, but I would advocate all ministers to have a go at trying to introduce some images, some pictures, some beauty into our churches. We would be the richer for it.
Thank you very much, Paul. Love that. Tim Carter, thank you. Two trees on the left. Automatically, I think of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Is there mileage? Does the cross become the tree of life? Do we have access to the tree of life through Jesus, or is my imagination just spiraling out of control there?
I think your imagination is spiraling out of control.
Thank you.
This is the gift of painting. You can go anywhere.
But if that's what it says to you, hallelujah.
There's something I think about paintings, being able to read them. And what you've helpfully done, at least for me, maybe for others here, is help us read a painting which we would just see as Jesus getting baptized, probably many of us. And I wonder if there's something, that's probably the resistance, I think, a lot to art in church, because we don't know how to read these works that are before us, which generations when they were painted probably were able to. Maybe it says this is something else we need to add to the theological curriculum of ministers in training, how to read theological works, paintings. Good. One final question.
Judith, yeah. I was struck with the way that you were talking about the Christian symbolism in what's obviously a painting of a Christian event, was in a church and carried theological meaning. But I wonder if you've any thoughts on how it was relating to the humanist themes in Renaissance art, because I was certainly seeing some resonances there, for instance, with Botticelli's Primavera and Birth of Venus in terms of the accompanying groups, Three Graces, that whole thing. And I wondered whether you'd any thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yes, the three angels can easily be read as the Three Graces, although that probably slightly predates Piero della Francesca. Botticelli is at least 2 generations later as an artist. The person in whose honor it may have been painted, this Abbot General of the Camaldolite order, who actually learned Greek in order to translate into Greek the council's decision so that the Greeks could take it away with them back to Byzantium, to Constantinople. He was also a renowned humanist in the Renaissance notion of the word. We use the word very differently now. I'm not suggesting he would have been a member of the Humanist Society, but he was a humanist. He was studying the ancient literatures and one of the very early humanists. And so there is perhaps some resonance of that, because that milieu was just beginning to begin to touch the Italian world. Although I think we have to remember how deeply, deeply irredeemably Christian it remained. It was that. And that person, the Abbot General, was one of the early teachers of I don't remember his name, Masaccio, no, not Masaccio, Marcino, who was one of the prime early Italian humanists, philosophers. So there is that kind of connection here.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your... I'm going to welcome up Edward Pillar, who's a New Testament scholar and Baptist minister. Have you got pictures, Edward? Oh, but we will enjoy your paper nonetheless.
Good afternoon. Hi. Okay, my paper is I'm Not Ashamed of the Gospel, but in it the righteousness of God is revealed, exploring the righteousness of God as the dynamic of community life and politics. And my aim in this paper is to think about the meaning of the righteousness of God that we find in Romans chapter 1, 16 to 17. The Apostle Paul writes, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith. And in particular, to suggest that we should be reading righteousness as a reference to community, the character of God lived out in the life, values, ethics, politics, and dynamics of relationships within communities. But right from the off, I need to